Thanks so much to Brad for that intro and to Gina for having me. Let's talk about garbage. Talk about some hot garbage. So I love that Brad talked about, my career in development and accessibility has really been to persuade everyone that we can all do this. And, it really starts with each day going to work and making the changes that you can for accessibility. It's okay to start now. Don't feel bad about it. However, I've gotten to this point where when I look at the landscape of the web, we're not doing so great. Like, if I'm going to be real about it for a moment, it's not really that great. And I think a lot of accessibility people, that's what the old man yelling at cloud is about, is that realistically, we're not doing that great about it. So this talk flips my previous endeavors and previous speaking and all of my experience kind of flips it on its head to go at it from a different approach and really lean into that pain and make us all experience that pain so that we can viscerally understand what people with disabilities go through on a daily basis when they're experiencing the work that we're putting out in the world. And the more that I've heard from people with disabilities about what their experiences are like, the more I take it to heart. And I hope that when you hear these stories and voices that I tried to highlight today, that resonates with you as well, because we are often in positions to make a difference. So as Brad said, I'm Marcy. I'm currently the head of learning at Gatsby, and that's a website generator that I love working on. I use it for my own website. This talk isn't really about Gatsby per se, but it will come up a little bit. My slide framework is built with Gatsby, so it's fun to be able to work with it. So accessibility. To me, it's all about making the web more inclusive to people with disabilities, including them in the process, reaching out to people with disabilities to be stakeholders, hiring them to work on our teams, doing user testing, because those insights are amazing, and you learn things that, if you would have learned them sooner, might change the trajectory of your projects from both the design and development perspectives. And if you're new to inclusive design and accessibility, I really love Microsoft's Inclusive Design Toolkit, as they have a series of personas that illustrate the human experience of disability and how we all can relate to it in one way or another. So accessibility in JavaScript applications is something I've thought a lot about. It's been a huge part of my career, as I find that if I just ignored it, it wouldn't help accessibility. So yeah, sure, maybe static sites without a lot of JavaScript are more accessible, perhaps, but I couldn't just leave this problem alone of knowing that a lot of the JavaScript apps that are being put out there are not accessible. But the accessibility problems out there are not limited to JavaScript applications. Like, there's an education gap on the web in general that I've been trying to fix for my entire career. But some days it just doesn't feel like it's going that great. So my work on Gatsby, I really wanted to go work on a modern website framework that had the potential to reach thousands of users. So making docs that have accessibility examples that don't have anti-patterns in them. Baking accessibility in at the framework level so that developers can benefit from those decisions, and then the users of those websites can actually use them. That's an ongoing work in progress. It's something that I'm hammering on daily, and I encourage you to do the same. But a lot of accessibility issues aren't unique to one framework or one website direction. It's an ongoing thing that we all have to continue working at, and it starts with compassion for our users. WebAIM, the group from Utah, Web Accessibility in Mind, they did a project recently called the WebAIM Million, where they ran an automated accessibility checker on 1 million homepages. And I have to be honest with you, the results were really depressing. It was sad, because it told us something that a lot of us already knew, but it really put it into a formalized context that we're not doing so great at accessibility. I encourage you to go check out WebAIM's website. They have some of the best learning materials for accessibility, so you can go learn about things more there. So I posed this question on Twitter, because I've had this feeling of we're really not going far enough for accessibility. I mean, we can't even do the basics. Like, every advanced talk that I do on accessibility, I end up having to talk about alt text and labeling our buttons and things that we should be doing but often aren't. So I asked this question for the people with disabilities out there: how does it make you feel when a website isn't accessible? Because I just had this feeling like, gosh, that's so hard. If you're blind, you can't just peek out of one eye and Surprise, I can use a mouse for an hour. Like, people who have disabilities live with them every day, chronic illnesses, things that really alter how you interact with computers and how you interact with the world. It goes the same for events, too. So these answers I got, things like, it depends on the website, but I'd say I mostly feel frustration followed by some anger if it's actually important to me. So these feelings, like, that's, if you're trying to maybe use online banking or do some grocery shopping online because it's easier for you, or, I mean, it really runs the gamut of all these different kinds of websites. If it's a task that someone really needs to complete and they can't because there's barriers to access, that's pretty frustrating. Like, I'd be frustrated too. Here's another person saying, I get frustrated, but then I kind of force myself to move on. The thing that bothers me the most is when sites have really small fonts or bad color contrast. There's a lot of design people here, right? That seems like something we could work on. Color contrast, interestingly enough, in automated scans of the top websites is the #1 accessibility issue. And a lot of times I have had these conversations with designers of like, no, it's in our brand guide, and that's a huge conversation. Sometimes as developers and designers, we can just tweak those colors slightly to give them more contrast while maintaining a similar mood and a similar design feel. So maybe there's some tweaking we could do, but also having those bigger conversations in your brand and in your design system about how are we going to create an accessible color palette. Here's another quote. I will leave the site, but in case of banking websites, I have no option but to look for help, and it makes me feel dependent. So for blind folks and low vision people, they have to get help if they have barriers to access on banking websites, all kinds of things. ATMs have this history as well, where someone might be defrauded if they have to give a stranger their PIN, or something at the point of sale. There's been lots of lawsuits and things around that have pushed technology to be more accessible, but it still comes up a lot, even at banks. Sites with animations make me dizzy, so I just close them ASAP. Every time I show an animation example, it doesn't matter who's in the audience, I always see people go like this. Because animation and motion that's just flashing, it can affect a lot of people, but especially people with vestibular disorder, motion sickness, traumatic brain injury, autism. There's a lot of situations where auto-playing motion can cause problems, and sometimes people turn JavaScript off for that reason. Perfectly valid reason. I feel a twist in the gut. I feel like an edge case no one cares about, a low priority ticket in a dusty corner. That's powerful. This was shared with me anonymously, which I was really appreciative of because this question forced people to really put their pain on display, and that's a hard thing to do. So this person gave me permission to share their quote because this is just such a powerful feeling that we have this backlog of issues, and every issue is an edge case or something in the abstract, when often these things not working it's people's lives, especially if we're working on services online that people depend on. So thinking about those, quote, edge cases as real people helps to motivate getting those things done. And then lastly, I feel excluded and invisible. I mean, if you could ask your users how they felt about it, that's not the answer you want to get, that they feel excluded and invisible. So I really want to lean into this pain. Let's acknowledge for a moment that this is people's daily experience, and that often as designers and developers, we're in positions to make this better. And I don't want to shame you or make you feel bad. I just want to, let's sit with this discomfort for a moment and just really honor the fact that this is what people live with and that we can do better. So in this talk, we're going to look at some patterns in a moment. I'm not going to fix them for you because the idea of this talk is just really to feel this, feel it, so that, people have to feel it every day because often it's not our users. We don't care about accessibility because those aren't our users. I bet you that's not the case, and those are some assumptions that we need to overcome. Because there's so many types of people out there. People are very diverse, and we can't control how they navigate with our sites. I think that came up a lot with the responsive web design, where we couldn't really get it down to pixel perfection and make sure that we knew how people would navigate with our sites. So we had to loosen our expectations a little bit, and that's okay. Not every browser is going to look the same. Not every screen reader is going to behave the same. And so really embracing that diversity of our users can help us ask them for feedback and try to make things that do work for more people. So talking about UI components, because we're at a design systems conference, right? So from the React docs, they say components let you split the UI into independent reusable pieces and think about each piece in isolation. To me, translated, that sounds something like components bake in our assumptions about design and development, often embedding barriers to access from a systemic level. So you have these individual components, and then they are deployed across websites. And all of those assumptions that you made about accessibility and design all of a sudden exist all over websites. And if we haven't thought about accessibility, it's really a missed opportunity. So I guess that's something to take away from this, is that if you're working on design systems and components, you have an opportunity with each one of those to add quality, to add some software tests, like unit tests for each individual component. And when they're integrated together, adding integration tests to make sure that focus is handled, and all of those things that I'll mention at the end about how to move forward with accessibility. Just recognize that you have opportunities to make this better. So let's talk about some garbage. Let's look at some garbage. And I have some garbage pail components that I've made especially for you. I have live demo Devin here sitting on the toilet. I think the can says, "I can't believe it smells like garbage." This was just too perfect. I had to show it. So live demo Devin. I've got this little drop down, and if I move my mouse around, I can't get it. Maybe if I just get my mouse like just so, I can click this. Does that maybe remind you of those hover menus where like no one can get to any of the sub-items? Equal opportunity in accessibility. So yeah, maybe like if you're just trying to drive the point home with your teammates, making a widget that moves away from your mouse might be effective. Here's another one. I have a button that opens a modal with tabs in it. But to make it more difficult, I've actually hidden the mouse cursor from everyone, so I can't even see where I am. I made this a little too hard for myself. I gotta like see, oh, there it is. So there's tabs in a modal. Has anyone ever had to take one of those designs and put tabs in a modal? Or anything interactive that is really an abuse of the modal pattern? Just kill it with fire. It's awful. So I have a little tab switcher in here with cats, dogs, and birds, and the cats, they have the perfect narrative saying, "Brr, I hate humans. They are so annoying, bite off humans' toes." Cats really get it, It's like get it with the garbage. So I'm in this modal. It's got the backdrop curtain behind it. Again, can't see where my mouse is unless I hover just so. I mean, for users who rely on a mouse, you're the default. You're the dominant user. And a lot of times I see non-semantic, not keyboard accessible widgets. I don't have to look very far for them. That's kind of the worst part about it. So I created these widgets with all divs. It's like divs all the way down. And that's really common, unfortunately. But it makes it so that keyboard and screen reader users can't really navigate those. Touch users, maybe, there are some use cases where people can use a mouse cursor. I have a quadriplegic friend that has a mouse that he can move with his mouth around, and so he can probably use a lot of interfaces that weren't made for keyboard users, but if you can't use a mouse at all, it just doesn't work. So I can't even really, there's a close button, our little modal. So yeah, hiding your mouse one day a week, maybe. I think that would be a good empathy tool for understanding that you shouldn't make everything rely on the mouse. Here's an example that shows another layer of what we were just looking at with our modal. If I click this button to put a curtain over the screen, that's essentially the backdrop that was behind that modal. But I haven't disabled anything in the background. So there's a button and a link here that I can still reach. And this happens so frequently with all of these modal layers. Like if you must add a modal layer, there is a way to do it right, and that means that you have to prevent these interactive items in the background from being reachable. It's just this kind of fundamental interaction thing that we need to know if we're creating these design patterns. And so it could be frustrating if you have this layer over things and you can't use a mouse and you're stuck back there, especially in a large web page. You might have no idea where you are on the screen, and so disabling the things in the background would really help. And just to make this more irritating, I have no way to exit this curtain without refreshing the page, because that's kind of frustrating. So, some more components. I have trapping Tam here. He's stuck in glue. And I have seen a really horrendous focus trap recently. And it says to me that the people who made it really just weren't thinking of keyboard users at all. So I have a little autocomplete widget that, again, I've turned the mouse off so I can't really see where I am on the screen at all. But if I hit tab, I can get into this little thing, and I can maybe do a little bit of filtering to get these items. But I can't even get past this widget. Like, it's trapped my focus, and now I can't get to anything. So that makes it difficult for me to interact with anything else on the page if I'm not a mouse user. So here's what the interface where I found this widget. It's a pretty good replica. It's not exact. I have changed the name out of the safety of the people who've made it. And that really, the purpose of that is that it's not really unique to them, so I don't want to shame any one group too much. However, if I tried to tab through this, now we see this widget in action, which is why it's important to test your widgets with other widgets around them, because if I try to hit tab here, I can't get past this thing. And this is an example from a real, like a product that people are selling. If I had my mouse, maybe, like the way the real widget works is you're supposed to be able to use your mouse, and then maybe I can get past this thing. It actually, the real widget, if I tab, it just automatically takes me to the next thing. So I can't even get past the widget without going to a page I didn't intend to. And then if I really dig in here, this example, I'm gonna make my dev tools a little bigger here. This example is just divs all the way down. And the challenge here is that it's tempting because you can use non-semantic elements and CSS and JavaScript like a really brutal hammer and make it look like an interactive user interface, but it's only interactive for some. So this has baked in a lot of assumptions about how people navigate, and if, say this was an HR application, it's making it very difficult for people who get hired on your teams to actually use the software that you've procured. So using more semantics, making things that actually work with the keyboard is just absolutely mission critical to what we're doing. So another example, I've got Carousel Cameron. Just sit with that pain for a moment. How many people have had to code a carousel? How about auto-playing carousels? Been there. Oh, carousels. That's why when I saw this image of Carousel Cameron with the carousel horses impaled, it just really, it spoke to me. It's like a work of art. So the carousel. I have an image gallery with a few images in it. I lifted this example from W3 Schools. My not favorite resource. And it works like gallery. If you can use the mouse, you can navigate through it. If you can't use the mouse, you just can't use this widget at all. Because again, it's divs all the way down. I did put in a special treatment here. If I scroll down, there's a little bit of like filler text about garbage being waste material that is discarded by humans, usually due to a perceived lack of utility. But if I'm scrolled further down the page, like say this is an agency page where there's multiple widgets, and maybe I'm like filling out a form and I have this auto-playing carousel, and then it sends my focus all the way back up to the top, that would be pretty frustrating. I've actually done that before. I had an auto-playing carousel. I worked at an agency, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna make this more accessible, and every time it rotates around, I'm gonna send focus back to the images so that they're announced in a screen reader. That was not the right way to go, unfortunately, because then if I am interacting further down the page, it's removing my attention back up to the top. And so that's like auto-playing focus movement is like an absolute no-go. So I'm actually going to take this one step further, and I'm going to fire up VoiceOver, which is a screen reader on the Mac platform. And before I get it going, I have some resources that I'll share at the end for how to use screen readers, since a lot of us we should be testing with them, but we're not daily screen reader users. Just testing with it and playing with it is a really great thing to do. You can get some cheat sheets to help with that. But the labeling for these images. So this example was inspired by a real carousel that someone had made. And I'm just going to fire up VoiceOver and we'll let it tell the story.
Caps lock on. You are currently on a group.
Okay, so I'm going to, since this thing isn't really accessible, I'm going to use the mouse.
A large black bear inspecting a dumpster. A dump truck full of cut wood. Group main. You are current. A large black bear inspecting a dumpster. A dump truck full of cut wood. A dumpster overflowing with garbage. Photoshop into a field with flowers. A dumpster overflowing with garbage. Photoshop into a field with flowers. A dumpster overflowing with garbage. Photoshop into a field with flowers. Group. You are current. A large black bear inspecting a dumpster. A dump truck full of cut wood. A dumpster overflowing with garbage. Photoshop into a field with flowers. A dumpster overflowing with garbage. Photoshop into a field with flowers. A dumpster overflowing with garbage. Photoshop into a field with flowers. A person with gum stuck to their boot. 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 A person
One
with
more,
gum stuck to
one
their
more.
A large black bear inspecting a dumpster. A dump truck full of cut wood. A dumpster overflowing with garbage. Photoshop into a field with flowers. A dumpster overflowing with garbage. Photoshop into a field with flowers. A dumpster overflowing with garbage. Photoshop into a field with flowers. A person with gum stuck to their boot. 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 Reusable water bottles. Reusable water bottles. Reusable water bottles. Reusable water bottles. Reusable water. F5. VoiceOver off.
I call that the additive label carousel. It's not quite a factorial carousel because that would be mathematically like we would have heard way too many thousands of labels, so I made it additive. But there was a real widget that someone made where they did that. And you might look at this carousel as a sighted mouse user and have absolutely no idea what has happened. So that's why it's super important to go and inspect and make sure that when you're adding accessibility features, or what you consider things to be features, that you've actually tested them. And getting some user feedback from people with disabilities really helps as you learn, how people use technology, because it can vary, not everyone's the same. But just verifying that if you're dynamically adding images, that you have good alt text and good labels. But this one, they had added the label from the previous image. So each time, we had to listen through those 5 times to get to the 5th image. So if you're a screen reader user and this thing's auto-playing, oh man, that would be rough. And the kind of worst part about it is that if we look at this interface, it doesn't really look off. Like, you have to really fire up a screen reader to understand how horrendous that experience can be. And so that gap of compassion for what your users might be going through is pretty wide. So that one's tough, but it was inspired by a real thing. Like, I didn't even have to make any of these things up. We don't have to look very far to find these examples. So the takeaway really is just not to assume. We can't make these assumptions. It's okay to not know, but we should also be asking for help and looking up resources, because users don't have perfect vision. It's not okay to require a mouse. We shouldn't assume that. We shouldn't assume that motion doesn't cause harm because it's fine for me or it's fine for my design teammate. We shouldn't assume that everyone knows what icons mean. Looking at you, Google Maps. These little teeny icons that you don't know what they are. Content doesn't need alternatives. We assume that about video and audio content. If you have a podcast, you should have transcripts, because people consume media in different ways. And then lastly, people don't fit neatly into boxes. The personas I mentioned earlier is just a starting point, because sometimes people have multiple disabilities, or they're on a spectrum somewhere, and people change, like it's a fluid thing. And so just not making assumptions that, I'm only supporting screen readers because there's only blind disabled users. Just accept that people are different, and that's kind of the beauty of it, and knowing that we can do better just by learning about people and then talking to them. So a little bit more, since I really front-loaded this with the pain, I'm not fixing any of these components for you live, even though I often live code fixing things. Instead, I'm leaving you with the tools to go solve them on your own. And so some things to know about people with disabilities are that they can have any number of ways of interacting with the world, from vision impairments, people who are blind from birth or have degenerative vision loss, color deficiency, mobility impairments. I have friends who've been in cycling accidents, and it forever changes how they interact with the world. People with cognitive disabilities, learning disabilities, traumatic brain injury, autism, hearing loss and being born deaf or going deaf, speech impairments where you can't actually say anything, so conversational UIs that don't have alternative ways of working with them might be difficult. The assumptions that we make about people and their abilities really get baked into our components with things like no focus styles. So not being able to see where you are on the screen if it is actually reachable with a keyboard. And I found through research that those focus styles are important for a lot of different people. People with mobility impairments who use switch access, people who zoom way in on the screen. Being able to see where you are is pretty important. The lack of keyboard access, like that one's so huge, it would help really all of us. People who are power users, all kinds of situations where keyboard access would be useful. Poor contrast and font size. We heard from a user earlier that that's frustrating to them. The inability to zoom, if you're low vision. I see a lot of older people in my life. I'll see screenshots of their phones, and the text size is almost always bigger because people's vision starts to degenerate, or they need to see things with more contrast and size. The inability to zoom, no screen reader support, auto-playing motion can be troubling, cryptic and unlabeled icons, and no captions or alternative descriptions. So these assumptions are things that we can all do better at, and that's what's great, is that we're here to talk about our work, and now that you know that these are things that you can actually improve at, like that's the first step. So to help you learn some of these patterns, because you don't need to reinvent the wheel a lot of times, the ARIA Authoring Practices Guide is a thing on the web that I really like as a starting point to go and look at what are the common interactions for a tab switcher? Like, all right, they've made the case, I have to build this tab switcher, how can I make it accessible? How can I make this modal dialogue accessible? So when you go to those conversations and you can't talk them out of that design pattern, you can at least go and look at how to make them more interactive to all users. If you're working with Gatsby sites, I recently wrote some additions to the accessibility page that we have on making a Gatsby site, or really any website, accessible, including some testing steps. You can use automated testing tools. I encourage you to do some manual testing where those tools can't really test those things. Like if I have my mouse-only widgets, an automated tool can't really tell me that I've forgotten keyboard support. So that's a manual testing step. Working with people with disabilities. This is probably the most transformative thing that you could do in your work. And there's two organizations I want to highlight. There's undoubtedly others, especially in your local communities. But Fable is a group in Toronto that I've worked with recently. They do user testing where you can sign up to have a meeting with someone with a disability, walk them through a design prototype or a product or something that you have questions about, and get their honest feedback about what the experience is like. I went through this process after working in accessibility for years, and I had my own assumptions I was surprised with how that process went. Access Works from Nobility is another group that does a similar thing, and so I encourage you to make that part of your process. Get that feedback. It's absolutely amazing the things that you can learn that you thought you knew, and sometimes it's just little tweaks that can make things better. And if you want to learn more about user testing, I am doing a presentation on October 10th. The Inclusive Design 24 conference is a 24-hour virtual free conference on accessibility. And I'll be doing a presentation there with a tester from Fable about the work that we did together. But you know who really explains this well? I love hearing from, because she's just so excellent at communicating ideas about systems of oppression and design and accessibility, is Tatiana Mack. And she'll be here tomorrow doing her talk on System of Systems at 2:30. And her other talks on accessibility and inclusion are just some of the best. So if you want to learn more about design systems and accessibility and things, definitely check her out. So for more accessibility info, because we've leaned into the pain, we've looked at the garbage, I can't just leave you without giving you ways forward. It doesn't sit right with me. So I have some tools and books and articles and resources on my website. There's specifically a page on web accessibility resources. Maybe that'll come in handy. There's some training materials there, some free classes you can take and things. So with that, that's it for me. So thank you so much, Clarity.
Those images are incredible, by the way. Those carousel. Carousel.
I saw it and was like, ta-da, it's the carousel.
Raise your hand if you have a carousel in your design system.
Ooh, I see some hands.
Pour one out.
They're like,
Pour one out. All right. Thank you for that. That was awesome. And I think that, just sort of, like you said, that visceral feeling of grossness is like a lot of people's everyday reality. And it's like, we're shielded from that very often, and we don't consider that. So you mentioned some great tips in there. I sort of wanted to dig in a little bit more, like you're sort of saying, like hiding your mouse maybe one day a week. That's like maybe a good sort of tactic to sort of start considering this. Like, are there other, like, I've seen some organizations do this with respect to, things like performance and stuff to like sort of try to inject, more considered, sort of constraints into their workflow in order to sort of better consider this. Like, do you have other things? Just, it's fine if like you don't want to sort of ramble off a bunch of quick hits, but I'm just like thinking like beyond like hiding a mouse one day a week. Like, are there other things that you could do to like bake that accessibility consideration into your workflow?
Yeah, I like the no mouse idea, and I'm if I get a little more time, I'll try and publish something that you can like npm install a dev tool to hide your mouse. I actually was gonna make it only happen on Tuesdays, like Tuesday was gonna be the day, but then I was like, nah, I'm just gonna deploy that to everyone at all times.
Yeah.
Because it could be a little confusing, you might waste some dev time going to figure out like, why can't I get the mouse?
Where's my mouse? So
that it could be done, intelligently so that you don't cause extra pain and then, everyone hates accessibility after that.
Yeah.
So
it's like tread lightly. It's like introduce these things, but like don't piss people off.
You got to take it right to that limit, you know? And I'm actually excited, some of the work that the Facebook accessibility team is doing around tooling of accessibility is really great. Like, they do things where they'll like put a big red box over stuff that doesn't pass accessibility checks.
Yeah.
So you're just blocked from seeing it in development and probably blocked from deploying it until it's fixed. So you could do things like that where like the visual display is impacted until you fix it, like no alt text, because if you don't have an alt attribute, it will read the file name, which with these cached, dynamic file names is like a big jumble of characters. So things like that, which you could accomplish with some CSS. I wouldn't necessarily call it basic CSS because everyone has different levels of skill levels. But workflow things like using a browser extension to test every time you have a new design, just checking it regularly and making it part of your workflow really helps so that you don't get to deployment and your QA team may or may not be accessibility experts.
Sure.
It's better if you kind of spread the responsibility around and do it little by little than kind of leaving it at the end and being like, we'll hire an accessibility vendor to fix it all.
Right.
It's like, that's a lot of wasted time and money, where if you just fixed it early on, some of the most successful times I had were prototyping early and often with a designer, where we were answering questions up front before we even showed a client, like, can we make that accessible? This design is great. Like, how's that actually going to work? And so that collaboration early on can really help. But just making it part of your workflow, like it's really all of our responsibility. Our project managers, our product owners, our design friends, our QA team. Like, if we all take a little bit of that effort, it can just make such a big impact.
I think that's absolutely true, and I guess sort of as a nice segue into sort of my next question is like, how do you see like the world of design systems helping to foster that or encourage that, or like are there sort of other things that make you nervous from like an accessibility standpoint around like design systems? Like you mentioned just by way of components, and components can bake in all like the sort of bad practices, but like how do you see like in all the examples that have been sort of shared over the last like few years around like fostering a better sort of accessibility culture in a company?
I think design systems and components are actually a really great opportunity to add accessibility in. A lot of the like cringy fear that I have is just about the web in general, so it's not specific to design systems.
Sure.
I mean, I will say that every time there's a new component library with a JavaScript framework, I assume the worst. like I'm a pretty optimistic person, but I know from experience that people are not thinking about it.
Yeah.
And so it's not really unique to design systems. Like
Yeah.
it happens on websites all over the place. And
Right.
so
Right.
yeah, I'm kind of like, this is me just getting real after 11 years of web development.
Yeah.
Of like, it's really not that great.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like-
We try, we keep beating that drum, boil the ocean one cup at a time. But,
Right.
And I do see light bulbs go on. Like people will say, oh, I didn't know about accessibility. And I'm like, yes, awesome. That's a win. Like that's an accomplishment. And it's not going to get perfect overnight. So we just keep beating that drum. But
yeah,
it's like,
you're getting at like the whole, it's tremendously frustrating to sort of solve this stuff like one thing at a time, one brick at a time. And that's where it's like that. Sometimes I get a little cringy about the words like scale, because that gets used and abused or whatever, but it's like that's what we're talking about here. It's like, how do we scale these like better practices, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like what we've been doing to date clearly ain't working, right?
Totally. Yeah, I think we just need to like keep telling your coworkers, tell your friends, try something new each week to improve your own workflow, and don't feel bad about it. Like that's not my intent. It's just we can sit with that pain. I mean, it's all of our collective pain. Like no one person is doing this. It's systemic.
Right.
But yeah, it's everywhere. But I do see opportunities. I think a lot of it doesn't matter if you're working, on a large scale, enterprise app or something more bespoke and small, like we can all do it. And I saw a conversation recently about like, should only enterprise websites have lawsuits, because lawsuits in the US are effective at making change happen. People with disabilities, rely on the law to make change happen.
Yep.
And so the conversation about Domino's going all the way to the Supreme Court to avoid like a $33,000 improvement to their site is just like mind blowing.
Yeah.
But the question was posed like, should only bigger websites have this responsibility? And my answer is like, absolutely not, because people with disabilities need to use all websites.
Yeah.
Like that's a pretty privileged gap to be like, oh, we don't need to worry about it. It's like, no, people
Right. We're flying under the radar. We can, yeah.
Every website, it's like we all have this responsibility, and it can be really fun and innovative. So I think if we kind of bring it back to the opportunity and like ways to make inclusive design like modern and innovative, that's what's kept me going this whole time.
Yeah.
Is that it can be really freaking awesome, and when something does work with the keyboard, it's so freeing because like you might have a repetitive use injury like I do, or friends and family that can't use a mouse, and so just knowing that support is there is the best feeling. So we should go for that.
Yeah, that's a great sentiment. I love it. Last question, just one word answer. Have you ever encountered a dumpster overflowing with garbage photoshopped onto a field with flowers?
I found the original of that, and I went for the photoshopped one because it was like that kind of like illusion of beauty, that I kind of see out there. It was a metaphor, really. I have seen a lot of overflowing dumpsters, though.
That's fantastic. Love it. All right, awesome. With that, everybody, we're gonna
That's it.
give it up for Marcy.